on the sort of like decarbonization agenda in Europe. I think these are not incompatible goals, and I do think that this is the moment where when it represents us as a tipping point where we can actually speed up our decarbonization, and in particular, rolling out of renewables, wind and solar generation in Europe, getting the infrastructure in place to basically replace Russian gas from the European energy system. And obviously with that, the benefits is obviously on climate, because gas is a fossil fuel first of all, but important for today is obviously limiting funding of Putin's war in Ukraine and supporting Ukraine as much as we can. There are obviously challenges of how we reduce our dependency on Russian gas between now and 2025 or 2030. We know that the energy system is very constrained at the moment, and finding every extra molecules of gas to replace Russian gas is challenging. And we cannot rely on the weather patterns, whether this winter is going to be very warm, and therefore we can postpone the winter season in Europe, or whether we should be relying more on when and to what extent China will come back to its with this economic activity and increasing demand for gas and LNG. So we all know that coming into this winter, it has been very so far lucky for Europe that it has a mild weather, but also the fact that China has reduced its gas demand quite dramatically. These two select factors cannot be taken for granted for next year, for example, and therefore the risk really is about whether Europe should rely on spot purchases of LNG for the next winter and the winter beyond the next one as well. What sort of like contractual models should our European energy utilities should rely on in terms of contracting for gas that replaces the Russian pipeline gas, for example. So all of this, is immediate and sort of like very short-term challenges that we need our governments from Western Coalition and G7 to support European energy utilities and global utilities to support the commercialization of additional LNG volumes to come into Europe to replace Russian gas.
Thank you very much for that. Surya, can we say Europe's main fault is running slow on decarbonization efforts to beat the changes in global energy dynamics, although it's the front runner in climate action? Would the member states be in a better position to alternate Russian gas if they had earlier invested more into renewable energy sources? And how do you see Europe's plans to tackle the energy crisis?
I think credit is due to Europe for being so advanced on renewables relative to the rest of the world. There are countries in Europe that are very, very, very high in their energy mix in terms of renewables. It varies from country to country, but you have, for example, 32% in Germany. Countries that are heavily hydro have higher percentages. Some countries have different wind mixes. Nonetheless, I think it's worth pointing out that over-reliance on any one energy source is a recipe for energy vulnerability. And what Russia has taught us in the last year is that vulnerability can be exploited by malign actors. And so while credit is due to Europe for being ahead of the rest of the world in its investment and development of renewable energies, obviously, in retrospect, had it been more developed and thus more diversified in its energy sources, Russia would not have been able to corner Europe so successfully. That said, it's also pretty clear that the renewables mix that Europe does have gave it just enough freedom to be able to implement the phase-in of embargoes on energy and Russian energy products. And so it's both true that there's never enough, but it's also true that Europe has done a pretty good job and has made some difficult decisions recently. And one of the reasons it's been able to is because it had a good renewables mix.
Thank you very much. Olga, I would like to turn you here. So Europe has relied heavily on LNG this year, and the International Energy Agency says the EU's coal consumption rose by 10% in the first 6 months of 2022. And this is driven mostly by electricity demand and will continue to increase. And production and transportation of LNG is thought to cause up to 10 times the carbon emissions of pipeline gas. And this move towards coal and LNG come at a time of high concerns about climate change. How do you see this dilemma? How can climate action help deliver the European energy security?
Sure. And let me just start with addressing the differences in carbon intensity when it comes to LNG or piped gas. I think when we're talking about piped gas, you're probably thinking, Russian gas, but it has been proven over and over again, and there are multiple sources that Russian production, even when it comes to piped gas, and when you add on all the deliveries, that's actually more carbon intensive than LNG coming from United States. So because producers, including US and others around the world, are a lot more thoughtful, a lot more transparent, and are continuously investing into making the process a lot less carbon intensive, reducing emissions. Now, have they reached optimal carbon reductions? Absolutely not. There's still a lot of room to go, and these advancements have to happen in the next several years, several decades, in order to ensure a solid place for natural gas in a world where we need to meet our net zero targets. Absolutely, those need to be accelerated, actually. But it's important to note that because of how natural gas is produced outside of Russia, the carbon intensity is actually a lot less. So when you're switching away from Russian gas, you are actually reducing emissions just right there. Now, I'm glad you raised the point in terms of short-term coal production increases. I think that this had to be done in order to ensure security of supply across for European customers, and make sure the lights can stay on, make sure that the industries are continuing to function. But in the long term, or even midterm, thinking through on how to fuel switch away from this coal, whether it's as many renewables as possible, and then some of that switching to back to natural gas, switching to greater energy efficiency investments, and thinking about overall demand and how that's being looked at.
Thank you very much, Olga. So I think it's important to mention the clean energy sources and the ongoing COP20 summit and its goals here. So the EU has long been considered a reliable advocate for the green transition. It has adopted far-reaching policies and already approved its 2015 climate neutrality goal. But Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Greece, and Hungary have all announced plans to extend the lifetime of the coal plants, reopen those that have been closed, or lift the cap on coal burning hours. This unexpected rise in coal burning appears to challenge the European Union's stated priorities for COP27. Dr. Kong, do you think the EU will be able to meet its targets of slashing emissions by at least 55% by the end of this decade? And how will this affect EU's credibility on combating climate changes?
Thank you. As mentioned before by the other panelists, I think there's sort of like very short-term sort of reactions of increasing reliance on coal generation, for example, is obviously to address the security of supply, and in particular the shutdown of Russian gas sort of to Europe. But we should not forget that, for example, in France, the nuclear capacity has been reduced dramatically, and therefore that was one of the factors that necessitated the increase in coal generation. There was a study by Princeton University, modeling number of pathways to basically get rid of Russian gas in Europe, and the study point out that actually that has a marginal impact on emissions, and in particular the changes in emissions compared to the continued reliance on Russian gas. And one of the factors is that basically energy efficiency will kick in more at a more aggressive rate, and in particular responding to the high energy prices that we see at the moment. So I do think that it is again, as I said, I think it's compatible, the pathway to reduce our reliance on Russian gas, and it's on the pathway to meet the climate change obligations that the European Union and the member state has set target to reach by 2030 or 2050. So I don't see that as incompatible in any way. Obviously, with the caveat that the energy efficiency, our responses to energy prices, and investment, unlocking both the renewables but also investment in energy efficiency.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kong. Carolina, how do you see solving Europe's energy crisis with the power of renewables? How doable is that given the current energy situation in Europe?
But here again, I think that we have to distinguish timelines. So what will happen this winter and then next winter or next 2 years, and with more LNG cargoes and more coal and more short solution. This is one thing, but this crisis will provide then ground to speed up actually going to more green energy and more renewables, because this is what we should all learn from crisis, and I think that this will happen because now it's clear. I mean, Russian gas, okay, now still struggling, and still some supplies are coming to Europe, like through Turkish Stream and through Ukraine as well, and we cannot afford to say, okay, let's stop everything and everything will be fine. But in few years' time, anyhow, there will be stop of Russian supply anyhow. And already with increased production of natural gas, this will also, I mean, from other sources like Norway will increase production. We will have more from Azerbaijan and so on, but this is all not to replace entire quantity of gas which was used before. So all this will come into the picture. More renewable energy, more electrification in transport sector, more green hydrogen. So, but it's only to cope with crisis immediately, like it's emergency, and then to really settle and this speedy take up of renewables. Because I know that many people, and especially, I don't know, NGOs or young people or from all this, they're always saying, yeah, but now we need more, we will use more fossil and we use this more coal and so ever. But this focus to somehow to fill the gap, and then to go back to green agenda, but in more speedy and more cooperative in even way.
Thank you very much. I think we can talk more about the ongoing COP27 summit, the UN's climate summit that's taking place in Egypt right now. Surya, what do you think are the energy industry's hopes and expectations are from this summit? How have things changed since last year's conference?
Well, I think last year's conference really laid the groundwork for high-level understandings of what different countries would need to contribute to a global climate change effort. The hopes for this gathering are that some of the technical details will be worked out. Unfortunately, that's tended to be where everything always gets much more contentious and much longer at the negotiating table. Of course, we all know about different factions that have different sets of priorities, different developing countries with different senses of what the contributions from the developed world ought to be. And then you have different geopolitical imperatives for everyone. So I think it's important to keep expectations realistic while also hoping that some kind of concrete technical agreement could come out of the discussions this week. Nonetheless, I think it's important to note that decarbonization work does need to continue, and a couple of things have shifted that may play into the success or lack thereof of the negotiations this week at COP. And one is that the United States has gotten serious about tackling climate change on a governance level. It doesn't mean it has become less controversial here, mostly, although certainly a slate of natural disasters has made it hard for most people to ignore the realities of climate change. But with the passage of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, recently by the US government, a huge amount of money has now been put into the United States doing what it needs to do to meet its climate pledges. There are, for example, I believe 36 separate renewable energy or clean tech technologies that the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, supports. When you add that to what the United States is contributing to the rest of the world in the midst of this energy crisis, I think you are looking at a change in the tone that the Western world will bring to the discussions at COP. Because whereas before the United States has always been a bit tentative about how it has approached these things, trying to avoid the political potholes back home, while also trying to maintain some type of global leadership. And that's ended up with a slightly confused, I think, presentation on behalf of the US government. I think now, at least under the Biden administration, the stars are finally aligned for the United States to carry its weight properly. And I mean to carry its weight in terms of its geopolitical power, but also carry its weight in terms of its climate obligations and the degree to which it has contributed to climate change throughout history and the degree to which it could be a climate leader going forward. Of course, politics are politics and politics are local and things could change. But I think right now, the United States, which has been an obstacle to some of these negotiations in the past, is finally stepping up and is prepared to engage fully and lead. And that could mean that there's a very big change in the odds of success for the climate negotiations this week.
So one more question to you here. So today the midterm elections are taking place. Do you think a change in the US politics will affect the US's policy on tackling the climate change? And do you think this would affect the current crisis in Europe?
All politics is local. And so, of course, whatever happens locally in the United States will have an effect on the administration's ability to engage at a working level on some of these issues. That said, I do think the Biden administration has been very clear that it prioritizes climate issues. With the energy crisis, there has become essentially a two-tier track. One is let's handle the short-term crisis however we can, and maybe that means LNG, for example. But in the long term, I think that what the energy crisis is doing is proving to governments everywhere that a more diversified energy mix, much like an investment portfolio, protects against supply shocks and vulnerabilities. And so I think, in fact, the silver lining on all of this is that the energy transition has accelerated because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and because of the ensuing energy crisis, because everybody has realized they need to do whatever they can do to enhance energy resilience, energy independence, and energy security. And clearly you cannot do that by being reliant on fossil fuels. So there will be an uncomfortable transition period, and that is what we are currently in. And yes, we are seeing spikes, for example, in coal use, and that is a tragedy, but we understand that that is now a short-term solution to what will be a long-term acceleration of the energy transition.
Thank you very much, Surya. Olga, what do you think will be the main topics covered at this COP27 conference that renewable energy companies should be looking out for?
Yeah, I think one of the top issues that's being discussed right now is the financial support, particularly for countries that feel like they have contributed the least in terms of carbon emissions, but have suffered some of the worst consequences and are forced to either not have enough electricity, or even the number of their citizens are, still don't have proper access to or affordable access to energy. So they would still like to strive towards a lifestyle where you have access to affordable, reliable electricity, just like, some of the countries that have contributed most to the carbon emissions out there. So they really want to see the burden fall on these larger economies. So I think that will be one of the main topics, and figuring out how to channel some of that financing towards projects that can both improve energy security in the developing world. And you saw IEA numbers for the first time, the number of people without access to electricity for the first time since they started tracking it has actually increased this year due to the population growth and other factors. So just making sure that these financing opportunities and these kinds of developing opportunities, there's a lot of cooperation on that, and there's support from countries that have in the past have contributed most to the carbon emission totals that we're seeing today.
Thank you very much. A reminder to our viewers that I will be soon moving to your questions. I see some of you are already asking questions. Thank you very much for that. But before we move on to our viewers' question, I have a question to all of you. Please feel free to join the discussion. So regarding our conversation so far, do you all think that sticking to these climate crisis targets is the way forward to also tackle the dependency on Russian gas, or overcome this current energy crisis in Europe? Again, this is a question to all of you. If any of you would like to start first, please go ahead.
Then I can start, because I think that climate crisis is much broader than we have now this energy crisis in Europe. And I think that actually maybe good thing in all these events is that this acknowledging the dependence on Russian gas, or acknowledging dependence on one source, and then how energy systems are fragile in Europe, somehow can kick off better changes and consideration of climate and energy together. So we cannot do just one thing and fixing one issue and then forgetting about another thing. This has to be in broader format, and I hope that this crisis now kicking in more global and faster solution, which we have to go for climate.
Okay, if anybody would like to add something. No, okay, then I will move on to questions from our viewers. Okay, neither Russian President Vladimir Putin nor Chinese President Xi Jinping are attending COP27, as these two countries have the highest impact on the carbon emissions. Do you think without their contribution to the negotiations, COP27 will be successful? Olga, maybe you can answer this question.
Sure. I'll start, and then I'm looking forward to seeing what additional comments the other panelists have. So I think this begs a greater question on what is the role of Russian energy sources in the future of not just European energy systems, but global energy systems, right? And I think much will depend on the outcomes of the war. I have a really hard time seeing a future where Europe will go back to a high reliance on Russian energy sources. everything is being restructured, rerouted, and Russia has really proven itself, even if you just take out all the atrocities and not even look at that and just focus on the kind of business partner they have been extremely unreliable, using energy to blackmail European countries to reduce their support for Ukraine, to weaken some of the sanctions. I mean, if you were in business with any company that behaved this way, you would try to find an exit strategy as soon as possible. So even just not even considering all the horrible, terrible things they're doing in Ukraine right now. So, considering that there's going to be either no Russian energy sources in the long term in Europe or a very minimal amount, really kind of figuring out what that amount is, I think is a great question. And how do you ensure that that amount is not high enough to once again to be used as a leverage? And then the third part of that is, how do you ensure that that amount is actually contributing to European climate goals as well? Because Russia has really, even before the war, Russia has really doubled down on the strategy of producing things as cheaply as possible, taking up as much of a market share as possible, and really just kind of sliding the climate goals to the side. Just they placed a bet on Europe and the rest of the world being behind on climate goals. That way they can just say, well, everyone else is behind. Why should we lead in this area? We're just going to try to optimize the resources that we have and try to make as much money off of that as possible. And this is even before the war. So that was Russia's strategy, even, in the last several decades, where you see other large producing nations who are, they understand the reality. And, you look at the Middle East and you look at the UAE and you look at Saudi Arabia. They really are looking at strategies to diversify investments, to how to leverage their economies in this new decarbonized world. Russia just took a completely different direction. So keeping that in mind is, if Russia wants to have any kind of role as a large energy exporter, first of all, there's a lot of reforms, a lot of changes that need to happen there, a lot more transparency in how they produce and the carbon intensity of their energy sources. I don't really see a huge future for them in Europe, just based on how they've acted as a supplier. I don't think there's going back to it. I think on the larger scheme and seeing if they could supply some quantities of oil and gas to other countries in the future, perhaps. But once again, going back and just really zeroing in on the carbon intensity of these sources.
I'll follow that up by adding that I think,
Surya, thank you.
I think we cannot view Russia and China from the same perspective when it comes to this. At this point, as Olga was saying, Russia's energy future is very hard to predict, and it's made itself a pariah state. Some of the decisions it's making are destroying its oil and gas fields now, because the physics of natural gas are such that if you don't have anywhere to put it, either you vent it or you simply destroy the well, and then you would have to drill new wells anyway. So the fact is that Russia's not being present at COP doesn't actually mean very much, because nobody would expect Russia to be cooperative or collaborative anyway. They aren't on any other front. So why would they suddenly become good climate citizens for the world? China is a very separate issue, because China is one of the world's superpowers. And for all of the criticisms that can be reasonably levied at China, the fact remains that you simply cannot tackle climate change without involving China. China is the greatest emitter, and everything that the rest of the countries of the world may or may not do is little notches as opposed to big steps towards solving the climate change problem, unless you somehow get China involved. That said, because China isn't a democracy, it has the ability to move faster than most countries when it makes decisions. And some of the decisions with respect to climate that China is making internally are actually quite noteworthy. China has some of the more aggressive laws in place. It has some enforcement mechanisms, and it's ramping them up. What I think the Chinese government has realized is that it is in its own interests for it to clean up its own environment. I don't think that China cares about the global environment, but I do think that China understands that it would be having a better time economically, and its citizens would be happier and therefore less likely to, for example, protest a bit against COVID lockdowns if they also had clean air and cheap electricity, et cetera, et cetera. So what we're seeing in China is movement towards climate change, or rather towards decarbonization. It's just not being done in a way that is easy for those of us in Western democracies to follow and to identify and to look at individually from some of the broader, slightly antisocial policies that China has in place in other areas and other sectors. So China's absence is a big deal from COP, but it is also worth pointing out that China is not doing nothing to address its own carbon issues. It's just doing it from a China first perspective.
Surya and Olga, thank you very much for that answer. There's another question on Russia's presence in COP27. Dr. Kong, maybe you can reply to this question. Is COP27 for climate change or an opportunity to gather and discuss how to tackle the war in Ukraine and the war between Ukraine and Russia without Russian interference?
Well, let me just follow up from Olga and Surya in terms of the role of Russia and China on this. I think the worst scenario would be for Russia to flare all of its Western Siberian gas, right? I mean, that's one point to the climate policy around the globe, and one can imagine Nord Stream 1 and 2 being destroyed, and a line pipe gas has been flared out of the Baltic seabed. So that would be worse. And in that regard, a potential win-win situation would be for Russia to ship all of its gas to China to displace coal in the power generation, which accounts for 10 to 15% of global emissions. So that could be potentially. But for that to happen, I think one would need to imagine some sort of like a settlement in Europe, and in particular, in which form that will be, in order to allow Russia and financing of the mega projects to connect its western and the eastern Siberian and the gas fields to China. And it takes time as well. So that could be a potential future scenario where there's more sort of engagement between Russia and China on gas that could potentially phase out some of the coal generation in China. But that's what I have to comment on this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kong. Another question on Russia's invasion of Ukraine is, how can we negotiate on climate when the world is facing an energy crisis fueled by Russia's invasion of Ukraine? I think without solving the war in Ukraine, it looks tackling the climate will not be possible. Do you agree to this?
I can start, and then I'm sure my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Olga.
Take over. I understand the complexity of the question, and it seems like these crises are overwhelming, but I don't think we can afford to look at these as separate issues. I think this has actually showcased how the two are so intertwined. Diversification of routes, sources, suppliers, and decarbonization at the same time, that actually improves energy security, and it makes it that much harder for countries like Russia to use energy as leverage. Building out more resilient systems where you're more prepared to tackle unexpected disruptions, whether it's climate change disruptions, whether it's someone blowing up your pipeline, and having a really fast, robust response, whether it's on your electricity network, on your pipeline network. All of these things, they both contribute to energy efficiency, energy security, climate issues. So I think tackling both, ramping up renewable production, homegrown renewable production, improving interconnections across Europe, both electricity and natural gas, building those out and providing more options of how the energy moves through, and fungibility of natural gas. That's extremely important. And things like building out nuclear energy, that is a low carbon baseload power. It contributes to both. So, and when we talk about Russian supply of nuclear fuel across Europe, building out alternative supplies from US and other countries, and ensuring that once again, you don't have another sector that's extremely reliant on that fuel just from Russia. So all of these things interconnect, and it must be done in tandem.
Thank you very much, Olga. Does anyone want to add anything, or shall I move to the next question?
I'll add just a little bit, which is that I think
Surya.
it's pretty obvious that the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the ensuing energy crisis is the catalyst for a lot of reconsideration about global energy markets, global energy mixes, and the importance of moving the energy transition towards net zero as fast as possible. And so while it's nonetheless very true that there are many crises in the world and many humanitarian crises, and on one level, it's hard to say, why are we thinking about the air that our grandchildren will breathe or the water that they will drink when we have mass famines in Somalia and refugee crises with the Rohingya and Ukraine on fire, well, simultaneously on fire and dark and cold all at the same time. We have to start now. And I think what this crisis has proven is that this is the moment that we need to start. And so I think rather than viewing it as something we should be doing in the alternative, I think we should view the entire situation holistically and realize the problems that we made that got us to the mistakes that we made and the problems that we had that got us to this point. For example, over-reliance on Russian natural gas, as well as the geopolitical realities that got us here, and then use this as the moment that launches us into a better future and into more diversified, cleaner energy mixes, greater international cooperation. And Ukraine can also play a very big role in that transition. Ukraine is uniquely positioned as a country to be a clean power hub for the rest of Europe, and thus to some extent the rest of the world, because all of these markets are increasingly interconnected. And so we can also try to help the reconstruction of Ukraine by advancing climate change, clean energy, decarbonization, the energy transition. Both of those can go together. And so I think we should absolutely make sure that we forget neither and do both simultaneously, because there is plenty of overlap and plenty of opportunity.
Thank you very much for that, Surya and Olga. So another question on LNG. Carolina, maybe you can answer this question. You can start to answer this question. The EU countries are replacing the Russian gas with LNG to cope with the energy crisis this winter, and they are consuming the most LNG resources. However, many emerging countries are not being able to get LNGs. How sustainable is that for the global energy consumption?
Oh, those are two questions in one. I mean, for global energy consumption and actually role of Europe and share of Europe, this is very much interlinked with demand and prices, and then market was actually proven that it works because when it was huge demand and huge prices, all those ships went to Europe. So for sustainable for global demand and global prices, and where LNG from Middle East will go, it's going to be Korea or Europe. This, I think, very much is related to the prices and how this will be balanced in between. For these emerging markets, but I understand this question like emerging markets in Europe, which they don't have this LNG so much. This depends very much on infrastructure, which is in place, but pipeline infrastructure. And many things actually changed this year. Shifting flows, things which were unthinkable before, like, I don't know, transit between France and to Germany because of different gas quality and odorization, shifting LNG gas all the way from Poland to Slovakia and to Ukraine and to Hungary, shifting LNG from Croatia all the way towards Hungary and Ukraine, and then some new issues like new features like Greek LNG coming to Bulgaria and then going further. So many routes and flows have been already changed. Still, it's visible that there are bottlenecks in this pipeline infrastructure, and then LNG actually cannot reach all European countries. But this crisis also showed that many things can be changed really in a very short period when it's needed.
Thank you very much, Carolina. We have one more question that I think is quite important to talk about. So I would really like to hear each of your answers on this. How long do you think this energy crisis will last? As there is a search for the energy prices, many European countries are putting cap on the energy prices, so it's not reflected on the people. But surely this will have a longer effect on the economies. Is there someone that would like to start on this question?
I'll happily kick us off. I estimate the energy crisis will last at least another few years. I think we are looking at considerable resource scarcity, resource insecurity, and price volatility while markets adjust to the supply side and in some cases the receiving side shocks that the system is currently undergoing. For example, what people are beginning to talk about is that the energy crisis for Europe in particular, and therefore for the rest of the world as well, is really going to peak next winter. If you look at what has happened this year, it appears that to some extent Putin misplayed his cards, by which I mean cutting off energy, cutting off natural gas, in particular to Europe, was one of his most important tools. He had the threat of nuclear weapons and he had the threat of cutting off energy. But he waited until August, September to mostly cut it off. And that gave Europe the opportunity to buy and store natural gas, albeit at astronomical prices. But nonetheless, they had the ability to do it. And that's how you get to the over 90% gas storages that we now see across Europe. Next year, that situation is not going to repeat itself. There are a number of ways, of course, that the war in Ukraine could continue, could pan out. There are a number of ways that could or could not affect power in Russia. Putin may or may not still be in power this time next year, for example. But in pretty much no situation does the future of Russia in the short term include the turning back on of the taps, because there will not be adequate governance, there will not be adequate expertise. Many of the natural gas wells have been damaged because, again, natural gas cannot just be turned on and off. There are infrastructure problems, for example, the bombing of Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. And then you add sanctions and political ill will. And while it's possible that someone comes to run Russia next year who is so extraordinarily gifted and competent and reliable and trustworthy from the point of view of the Western world, that they suddenly say, okay, no more sanctions, and yes, we'll buy all of your gas again. Probably not. And so we're looking at a situation where, because of the physics, because of the infrastructure, because of the sanctions, because of the war, because of Ukrainian reconstruction, because of the energy transition and decarbonization, and many other reasons, Europe is not going to be able to buy natural gas from Russia. And yes, European consumption, imports of natural gas from Russia have dropped from about 40-45% to about 8-10% now. Nonetheless, a huge percentage of the gas currently stored in European storages was Russian, or rather is Russian. And so without that source for next year, Europe is not going to be able to get to 90-something% of gas storages. And US LNG has saved the day. US LNG exports are up 12%, but the US field's ability to produce more is maxed out. Not only that, but the US lacks the adequate infrastructure, both in terms of natural gas pipelines, but also in terms of terminals, compressor stations, essentially. And then Europe lacks the ability to import any more LNG because it doesn't have enough terminals and import capacity. So what will happen next year is that much of what made this winter ultimately survivable will not be available next winter. And there won't yet have been time to build renewable alternatives or nuclear or biomass at scale or geothermal, et cetera. And so we are looking, I think, at a very serious energy crisis next year. And while Europe can afford to buy what sources there are at crazy prices, the rest of the world cannot. And so even if Europe finds a way of scrambling and pulling LNG from Nigeria, for example, or more from Qatar, that's going to leave countries like Ecuador or like Sri Lanka or like Pakistan in very, very dangerous situations energy-wise. So things are going to get worse before they get better.
Thank you very much, Surya. Dr. Kong, can I continue with this? How long do you think this energy crisis will last?
Well, I tend to agree with what Cyrus just mentioned. I think, next winter is going to be very difficult for Europe. That's for sure. Essentially, I think, we can understand the problem for next year is like, German energy industry competing with potentially China's industry, because basically the International Energy Agency just made an analysis saying that the potential gap for the next year could be around 40 BCM, 40 billion cubic meters of gas for the next winter, and that's roughly equal to the entire annual consumption from German industry in terms of gas. So you can imagine that that's the gap that potentially Germany is the only country in Europe could potentially pool LNG from developing world, and in particular from China, if the Chinese industry and economic activity revamps again, and therefore go on to the quest for additional LNG, because next year and the year after the next one is going to be very tight in terms of the commitments on the LNG cargoes versus the demand, incremental demand. So essentially that's the equation is how Germany will be closing the gap. And in particular, the potential for deindustrialization in Europe, and in particular Germany.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kong. Olga, what do you think?
Yes, so I think this actually touches on to several other questions that were asked right before this as well. This is an investment crisis that actually began before the war. So if you recall, last year around this time, the prices already started going up. So because we had chronic underinvestment both in oil and gas because of lower pricing, and part of that was due to COVID and other reasons over the last decade. So the biggest, getting to the bottom of this issue is in investing in additional supply. That is how you resolve this crisis. And I agree with my colleagues here, who are saying we have to be realistic about how much supply can come online in the next couple of years. And in terms of this crisis, how long it will last, I would say it's a 3 to 4 winters kind of crisis. And here is why, is because, in agreeing to your assessment on the role of Russian natural gas and how that can support the next couple of winters and the uncertainty around there. But I think being realistic about how much more investments on the US side, but also other producers around the world, how quickly they can bring additional capacities online. I think that needs to be expedited. I think that needs to be done as soon as possible. There are some opportunities if we can get some reforms done here, permitting reforms done in the United States to allow to expedite some of these projects, to allow additional capacities, but also there's some tremendous opportunities around East Med in other countries, particularly African countries that could definitely ramp up, but they have their own unique different challenges as well. And this actually, goes back and touches on how Europe is kind of hugging all these natural gas supplies right now. So, the way to solve that is to ensure there's additional supplies out on the market, because these smaller countries who don't have as many resources and who can't compete, they are suffering. They will be having, blackouts. They will have adverse economic consequences. So I think, looking into solutions on ramping up supplies and also seeing how quickly you can invest in renewables. Repower plan from EU, they just announced additional emergency measures to accelerate permitting for solar heat pumps, repowering power plants too. And I think that's brilliant. That's exactly what's needed to happen. But we'll have to be realistic about how many renewables, how much capacity can come in online in the next year, 2, 3, 4 years, and also efficiency measures all across the supply chain, from the way energy is produced to the way it's transmitted to the way it's being utilized at homes and in industries.
Thank you very much, Olga. Carolina, what do you think about the longer effects of this crisis?
I agree with all my colleagues that crisis actually will only start, unfortunately, and this is going to last. Let's hope for next 2 to 3 years. But I think that we will all learn value of energy efficiency, value of decentralization energy solution, value of cooperation and innovative thinking in crisis situation.
Thank you very much. And I think we can finish here if there's anything left that we haven't mentioned. Thank you everyone for joining us in today's discussion on unlocking the European energy security, how to respond to the energy crisis in Europe, hosted by the Circle Foundation, a non-profit, independent and non-partisan think tank based in London. I'm Aslı Atbaş, and my guests today were Olga Kakova, Deputy Director of European Energy Security at Atlantic Council, Carolina Chegir, Senior Gas Expert at Energy Community Secretariat, Dr. Kong Cheong, Professor of Political Science at the Columbia University, and Surya Jayanti, Managing Director of ENEI, a US-Ukrainian decarbonization company, a former US diplomat, and an International Energy Council at the US. Thank you all for joining us today, and hope to meet soon in another discussion very soon. Thank you very much.